I consider myself to be a bit of a strange person. The things I find fascinating are usually things others just question or ignore. If there is a particular passion I have, it's academia and comics, as some of you may have guessed. Not like I hide it at all. I find it a fascinating field, and I feel some people just don't know about it. I love the appliance of real-world physics, math, science, history, and a load of other subjects to pop culture, especially comics and science fiction. I think it's something that people would love if they knew more about it. The first time I stumbled across academia focused on comics was when I found a copy of The Science of Superheroes by Gresham Weinberg in a charity shop by my college. I was going through a lot of doctor's appointments and I found myself regularly visiting the book while in waiting rooms. I found it fascinating, incredibly fascinating, and now, almost 10 years later, I've found dozens of books, hundreds of videos, and thousands of articles, all focused on academia and comics. I often wonder if I would ever have gained that love if I hadn't picked up that used book all those years ago. So I wanted to do the same for others who might have that passion but have never stumbled across these books. I've far from read all of them. I find new books I want to try almost every week, but here's a few that might get you started and can probably be picked up pretty cheap used or on Amazon. As I said, the first book that really got me into studying comics was The Science of Superheroes by Gresham Weinberg. The book is nicely set up into chapters specifically related to certain characters, going between both Marvel and DC, as well as Donald Duck for some unknown reason. For example, the first chapter covers Superman, of course, but talks about subjects such as the Drake equation, trying to figure out if the planet Krypton could even exist, what makes Superman, well, a Superman, and how gravity would affect Supes in daily life. There's a lot more to it, but I'm trying to be a little brief. Speed is discussed greatly in the Flash portion, and both Namor and Aquaman are given their dues in a joint section discussing aquatic physics and biology. There's a companion book by the same team under the title The Science of Supervillains. However, another book that fits well with these two is The Physics of Superheroes by James Kakalius. I know I mispronounced that. Another excellent book that doesn't split its chapters up in the same way, but covers some very interesting topics using whichever superhero fits best into the discussion. Again, overly simplified. For those interested in physics especially, all three of these books are wonderful starters. There are plenty of books that focus on specific characters. For example, Smart Pop has put out quite a few that are made up of articles and essays with various subjects on specific characters. If I had to recommend a few, I'd suggest Web Slinger on Spider-Man, The Man from Krypton, obviously Superman, and Batman Unauthorized. All have a very varied selection of essay subjects and writers with chapters that can be read in any order. There's also two books by Glenn Weldon that I do heavily recommend if you're interested in the history of either Batman or Superman. Superman the Unauthorized Biography and The Caped Crusade. Both are incredibly extensive and in-depth. Of course, there are also plenty of books on Batman alone, so maybe also look up The Many Lives of Batman, Batman Unmasked, and A Dark and Stormy Night. Perhaps you're more drawn to costumes, you love the flashy looks or colourful designs. So, might I suggest The Superhero Costume by Brownie and Graydon? Admittedly, I know both the writers, but even regularly speaking to one while the book was being written, finally getting my hands on it taught me far more than I expected. The book explores a lot of the origins for the modern superhero costume, diving into iconography, such as the history of the capes and trunks on the outside. Yes, those are trunks, not underwear. They even have belt loops. A few characters are described in detail, but largely chapters are dedicated to specific items, such as the psychology behind the mask. That's a particular favourite part. One I used a lot when writing my undergraduate dissertation was Comics for Television, Films and Games by Taylor Weaver. This book is heavily focused on the field of transmedia storytelling, a subject I sort of covered here a while ago, but it's the nature of stretching a world or story across multiple mediums, with everything still being canon. The book is great for how many franchises it covers, as well as the depth it goes into in regards to history. Very surprising, but also very specialised. Not overly interested to anyone who doesn't care about transmedia storytelling, but still great. It's a bit of a classic, but I have to give a shout out to the works of Scott McCloud, particularly Understanding Comics and Reinventing Comics. Must-reads for any scholars of comics that break down how we read comics, the history of the media, semiotics, and the nature of time. What makes these books so accessible is that they are presented in comic book format. They are comic books about comic books. I'll throw one more in the comic books about something list. Filmish by Edward Ross, a comic book that tells the history of film. I don't get to recommend it much, so I'll throw it in here for fun. If it's the making of comics you're interested in, Scott McCloud also has a third book called Making Comics, also in the comic book style. But I also want to shout out a very recent book called How Comics Work by Tim Pilcher and Dave Gibbons. This book goes into fantastic detail on everything that goes into making comics. Fantastic for those looking to break into the industry or just curious about the process. And for the record, it's homegrown British. Maybe you have a flair for history, you want to know how we made it to the point we're at now. Well, for Marvel, check out Marvel Comics The Untold Story by Sean Howe. There's so much information packed into this one book, and yet it never comes off as dry. There are so many amazing stories about people in the industry and points in time. I've gotten so many ideas from this book. It's a bit of a thick book, but I do also recommend the audiobook. I think I've probably listened to it about 3 times now, and I'll probably still listen to it again. If you're interested in the era of history that involves the Comics Code Authority and the work of Frederick Wortham, then definitely pick up The 10-Cent Plague by David Hajadu. While I can't say anything about the man who wrote it, if you're interested, also maybe pick up Men of Tomorrow. If you don't know what I mean, then look up Gerard Jones and maybe die a little inside. I'm sorry, but it's still a decent book. For a massive textbook on the history of comics from the 30s onwards, try Superheroes, Capes, Cowls, and the Creation of Comic Book Culture by Lawrence Maslin and Michael Cantor. It also had a PBS 3-part documentary that's worth checking out. To round everything off with a few odds and ends books, Superman on the Couch by Danny Fingeroth explores the psychology of superheroes and written by the former editor-in-chief at Marvel. Was Superman a Spy by Brian Cronin goes into depths about various misconceptions and legends around comic books, companies, and creators, which is enormously fun to read. I breezed through it in a couple days, surprisingly. War, Politics, and Superheroes by Di Pialo does exactly what it says on the tin and talks about war, politics, and superheroes, with a lot of really interesting articles I've never really thought about before. Supergirls by Mike Madrid is a good one to check out if you're into feminism or just female superheroes. And finally, The Essential Guide to World Comics by Tim Pilcher and Brad Brooks. A very interesting and comprehensive look at how comics evolved around the world. That's 27 books to get you started. There are plenty of other books to check out, and the obvious one that I'm sure plenty of people are shouting at me in the comments. For the record, I haven't yet read Grant Morrison's Supergods, so I don't feel right recommending it. I hear good things about it, but honestly, I just haven't gotten around to it yet. I also want to shout out the various Marvel and DC encyclopedias, as I think that's something everyone should pick up, especially those getting into comics. But this is a list of books about comic books, and you guys have no idea how much I wanted to add Superman at 50 for obvious obsessive reasons. I want to also shout out a NerdSync video from the end of last year that suggested several books that even I hadn't come across. It's definitely worth your time to watch. If any of you picked up these books or have your own suggestions, please mention them below. I'd love to hear what you think, or even if you guys know any that I don't. And okay, 2 extra books. Minutes to Midnight following essays on Watchmen, and for the Miracle Man fans, if you can find it, Kimote.